Now we're going to be looking at the very beginning of graphic design, and so we're going to be starting with the very basic question everybody asks, which is what is graphic design? Welcome back. Now we're going to be looking at the very beginning of graphic design, and so we're going to be starting with the very basic question everybody asks, which is what is graphic design? Now, according to my definition, graphic design is visually communicating to a targeted audience using one or a combination of images, texts, icons, illustrations, and other graphical elements with the aim of problem solving. Now, what does this mean? This means that as a graphic designer, you're practically a problem solver. Now, let us put this into perspective. I like to use examples as I talk. I believe that you also enjoy examples too, because it's going to hasten or hasten the learning process, right? So let us look at this example. Let's say we have a client come to you and say, let's say you're a graphic designer and a client comes to you and say, see, I want you to do a flyer for me because I want to sell some products. He identifies that he needs a flyer from you, and you as a graphic designer basically understand one thing, that he has a problem. The client in question has a problem and he has come to you to solve that problem. That is why problem solving is in the definition, because as a graphic designer, you basically solve people's problems. Now, when you take someone's design or you take someone's challenges and you put them into design, into a visual design, and put them out there, and that design converts or that design brings the desired result, you've basically solved the client's problems. So as a graphic designer, your number one role, your number one task is actually to solve people's problems, right? So when you do designs, you should always think about solving a problem as your basic or your end goal. You should not think about the design, the beauty of the design per se, or should be thinking about the kind of images you're going to be using. You should be thinking of how these things are going to be combined in order to create something that is going to what? That is going to bring the desired result. So basically, as a graphic design, you solve problems. Now, graphics it's a broad word, right? And for the fact that we're talking about graphic designs, there are several kinds of graphics that we have, our graphic designers that we have out there. Now we are looking at the digital one, which involves us using a laptop or a computer basically to do designs, right? We have other artists, people that draw, people that illustrate, people that sketch on paper, and the rest of them. And all these people are designers and artists. So we are actually all in the same industry, but we use different tools for our work, right? So while we talk about graphic design, we're actually looking at graphic design that involves what? The digital media, basically, or that involves digital works. And we call this the still graphic design, right? So under still graphic designs, we have two types of graphics, right? And these two graphics are called the vectors and the raster graphics. So what are vector graphics? Well, according to my definition, vector graphics are objects that are made up of lines and curves, right? And also, not only are they made up of lines and curves, but they are also easy to manipulate or work on because their lines and curves are held together by points called nodes. Now, you see these things called vector, or these objects called vectors, they are objects that are made up of lines and curves. So like an example of an object that is made up of lines and curves, we'll be looking at, let's say, your circle shape or your triangle shape is made up of lines, right? Or your square shape, your trapezium, kite shapes. Most of these shapes are all made up of, basically anything you can think of is made up of a shape, right? But when you're designing, if you're trying to create some shapes, you're basically creating vector objects, right? And these vector objects are made up of these lines and these curves, and they are connected by tiny dots called nodes, right? Your text also, it is worth noting that your text also is a vector. So basically, when you're working in any graphic design software and you're working with text, you should always remember that texts are vectors, right? So one other property or characteristic of vectors is that they never lose quality, right? They retain their crispness, their sharpness, even when they are scaled to any length. They are resolution independent. Now what this means is that a vector shape is sharp and crisp, and no matter how big you make it on the design on your canvas where you're working, no matter how large you scale it or how small you shrink it, it does not lose its quality. The body remains the quality of the body remains lossless. All right, so it's basically scaled up with numbers. So it doesn't have a resolution per se. It doesn't have something, a fixed size or something. It can be scaled, can be scaled down, can be scaled up. So they are very, very good. But not only are they good, vectors can also be identified, or basically we've said this before, they can be identified as geometric shapes and text in almost every design software. We mentioned that, right? And also, they are ideal for making logos because of their scalability factor and generally small file size, right? So what does this mean? Well, basically, if you're working with vectors, you're working with files that you can manage very well. They really don't give you too much problems in terms of how they are going to be dragging your computer or eating up your RAM and stuff. They actually are really small in size, and when you're working with them, because they are very simple in nature, they don't cause much problems for you. And their sizes are really small. When you save them, they usually just have like a very small size on your computer space. So vectors are actually very good to work with, and that is why they are ideal for making logos. Not only are they scaled, or are they scalable, very scalable, but also their sizes are very moderate, so you can actually move them from one system to the other without much stress, right? And you know, when you look at your billboards outside, you see that, like for example, we have the MTN, we have so many of them. You see them do their ads, they run them on billboards. Now these ads that they run on billboards, you see their logos displayed in very large sizes there. Now if you're working with, if that was a vector shape, basically you can scale it to that size and it will not really cause problems, unlike a raster. But we're going to be looking at a raster pretty soon. So that is basically vectors. In our illustration classes and our business branding design classes, we're going to look at vectors in more detail, right? But for now, let us just keep that and go to the other type of graphics that we have. So we have rasters as well. But rasters can be defined as images that are made up of tiny square dots called pixels. So rasters are made up of these tiny square dots called pixels, right? And what do pixels do? Well, basically, pixels are these tiny boxes that have like a single color, but when they combine together, they form an image. Now, I'll give you a very, very brief example. You see, when you see the phones we use nowadays, the smartphones we use nowadays, they all have cameras, right? At the back, at the front, and these cameras are measured in pixels, right? They're measured in pixels. So when you hear megapixels, it actually refers to a million pixels, right? Mega refers to a million, so pixels refers to pixels, right? Which is the same thing we are talking about here. So a megapixel is basically 1 million pixels. So if you're, let's say, this is off topic, but if you have a camera, let's say you have a phone that has a camera of like 48 megapixels, it means that whenever you take a picture, that picture is generated by what? 48 million pixels. Basically, that picture is composed of 48 million pixels. So that is what your camera is generating for you. So that when you compare it to someone that takes a picture with a 5 megapixel camera, you will now understand why the difference in the quality is there, because one picture is made up of 5 million dots, that is 5 megapixels. The other one is made up of 48 times 1 million dots, which is 48 million dots. So you can tell that one has more quality, more detail than the other one. I could give you a practical example right now. I could tell you that, okay, take 1 minute out of the time watching this video, you're spending watching this video, to do one very short practical example for me. So right now, what I want you to do is take up your pen if you have one and try to draw a capital uppercase letter B for me with just 10 dots. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to do that. Just draw 10 dots, use 10 dots to try to generate the capital letter B. And you're going to discover that while you're trying to do that, yes, you might actually manage your dots very well, but when someone looks at that, they may or may not really get that you're trying to create the letter B with 10 dots. And now that is not a problem. It actually is a problem because the number of dots you're using to generate that letter B is actually not very sufficient. But now if I ask you to increase that to like 50, if I ask you to draw the letter B with the same letter B with 50 dots, you can see that you have more than enough dots to actually generate that letter B, right, to perfection. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the more dots you add, the better your object, or the better your image. So that is how rasters are basically. Those dots that we are talking about, they have what we call a resolution, right? Or rather, they are like the resolution. So the number of dots per inch, or the DPI, is what determines the quality of that image, of that raster image, right? So By the ways, that should have given you an idea that all the pictures you take on your phones are actually raster images, right? They're all raster files. So yeah. And let's go back to the definition. So we are looking at rasters, and like I said, they are resolution dependent. That means their quality is restricted to the number of dots or pixels per inch, right? So they have a limited resolution, which means when you're working with vectors, there is a level to which you scale them, you scale it, the point that it gets to its saturated resolution. And at that point, what happens is that if you scale it further, it begins to look bad. So vectors have resolution, limited resolution, right? Yeah. Sorry, rasters. And then also rasters can be edited by manipulating the individual or group of pixels making up the image. So like I said, well, basically, while you're working on vectors, you work on the nodes, which are the points that joins or connects the lines together. When you're working on the vectors, because vectors are made up of those tiny dots, you're basically editing those tiny dots. They can also be used for logos, but are not generally preferred because of their limited scalability. So like I said, basically you can do, they are all graphics, right? Vectors are graphics, rasters are graphics. You could use raster objects to create or generate logos as well, but your logo might be heavy, and also trying to scale or scale down might be something like a stress, all right, compared to working with vectors that can scale up or scale down easily. Photoshop is an example of a raster editing software. You know, we talked about vectors, and I said you can illustrate, you can draw objects using lines and curves with vectors, right? And the kind of softwares you use for doing that is CorelDRAW, Illustrator, InDesign, the rest of them like that. And then for raster editing, the dedicated software you can work with is Photoshop. We also have GIMP, but we're not going to be looking at GIMP. So we're working with Photoshop, and that is the standard, industry standard software for working with raster images. So JPGs, PNGs, GIFs are some of the popular file extensions of raster files. So like I said, JPGs, the pictures you take on your phone, the PNGs, they are basically what? Raster files. So when you see a file or an extension or something that has those file extensions, you can basically tell yourself that, oh, I am looking at a raster file right here. In our next video, we're going to be talking about the elements of graphic design, where we're going to be breaking down each and every individual element that makes up graphic design. So stay tuned.